Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We're an open dialogue on education, the arts, and social change. And today we're doing a show that I've had in mind for a long, long time. Claudia and I are visiting with Ralph and Nanette, our dear friends here in Long Island City. And Ralph is one of the great spiritual leaders and educators and spiritual people of our time. He is the co-creator of the New York Open Center in Manhattan, and began in Soho, and now it's on 30th Street. But also he's been involved in the holistic movement. He has been one of the pioneers of holistic education, of the holistic spiritual and wellness movement. This morning we're watching the royal wedding on TV, and I said to myself, if this movement had a king, it would be Ralph White. It would be Ralph. So, King Ralph, we're here with King Ralph, and but both of us love democracy too much to want to worship that kind of royalty. But also, there is a democratic ethos in the spiritual wellness movement. We want to just have a nice half-hour dialogue, and then we're going to be joined later by Nanette, your wife, because Nanette, partner, we use the word partner, who also is very important to us in terms of her work in the NSP, Network of Spiritual Progressives. And but let's begin with Ralph and how you got involved with the holistic movement. Growing up in Europe, okay, what was some of the early factors that led you toward this career, this path of being the pioneer of the wellness movement and the holistic education movement?
I certainly didn't grow up in an environment that was favorable to this. I spent my teenage years in the industrial north of England in a grimy town covered in 150 years worth of soot. And then when I got to university, the reigning philosophical worldview was logical positivism, this petty linguistic pedantry. It was, as I say in my book, I'd finally arrived at the Hall of the Philosophers and nobody was at home. So there was nothing, I was one of those kids that was asking from an early age, what's the point? Why are we here? What is this thing, life? And what do? You just grow up, maybe you get married, maybe you get a job, then you die. I mean, that seemed to be, there wasn't much of an answer. So I was always looking for something deeper. I grew up very aware of the Second World War. My father was in the thick of that. My grandfather was in the thick of the First World War. It was not obvious to me that there was some kind of divine spiritual presence in the world. I had to really work for that. So it was really only when I came to America as a graduate student, having done a degree in American Studies in Britain, that down Route 66, that first Christmas, answering an ad for a co-driver to go from Chicago to LA. That was really...
May I get your kicks on
you got
Route 66, that Route 66.
It winds from Chicago to LA, more than 2,000 miles all the way. Get your kicks on Route 66. Well, I did, and that was down in those deserts of New Mexico and Arizona. I had a real awakening, the silence, the beauty, the scale, the mystical grandeur of it all. Listening to George Harrison's All Things Must Pass had just come out all the way. So that was a time of transcendence for me, in which it was time to really, I had such powerful mystical experiences, inner experiences, that then I had to say to myself, well, if these are real, nothing could be more important. On the other hand, the intellectual side of my being was going, how could there be, given what's happened in the 20th century, the horror, the Holocaust, the wars, the nightmares, Stalin, Mao, I mean, how could there be some divine order to the cosmos? So I had to really reconcile the inner mystical experiences I was having with the more intellectual, rational, political, social justice side of myself to really, go forward, because I couldn't give one up at the expense of the other. They both had to be. So that's how it all got going for me.
I wanted to ask you, this is the question that just came to me, is how did you get to be such a powerful orator and raconteur? I mean, I could listen to Ralph for hours, just hold forth, and it's important information. It's good for people to know this stuff. I think, like you talk a lot about the loneliness that people are experiencing today. This book, The Jeweled Highway, On the Quest for a Life of Meaning, was really a life-changing book for me, Ralph. I want you to know that. And because you've lived your life as an adventure. And so many people out there today, they're bored with their work. They're stuck in this materialist society, overworked, coming home exhausted, searching for meaning. The traditional religions don't seem to be delivering. And what you have, what the holistic movement offers, is a more ecumenical approach, choosing from different spiritual traditions. How would you give, in a nutshell, to share with the world, what is the holistic movement all about in terms of spirituality, wellness? You bring three things together, right? Spirituality, wellness, and there's a third thing? Ecology. The ecology movement is,
ecological and spiritual. Well, what is it about? I think firstly it's about human freedom. Not feeling compelled to buy into any particular religious worldview. The one that I grew up with certainly didn't speak to me in any significant way. I had to set out on my own path, a path of experience. So it's not so much when it's not about faith, it's about experience, or gnosis as it used to be known as. I think the last thing we need in this world is just some kind of blind faith. We need to actually test these insights into the deeper nature of spiritual reality against the experience of living. And I think we have to do it in a pretty meticulous way. It's got to be real. There can't just be some... the New Age fantasy stuff, to me, the ungrounded New Age fantasy spirituality is just as disturbing in its own way as the hardcore materialism that permeates so much of Western and American culture. I think we have to find the balance between the two. So it's about being free, of course, like all paths. It's ultimately about love. It is about love. I mean, that's what the intermixing of love and freedom. And I think it's about, on a spiritual level, being open to all the world's spiritual traditions. Here we are in New York, where the whole planet is here. So we want to be listening to all the spiritual traditions that have integrity and substance. I think we're going to, it's a time of learning. We want to be learning all those modes of learning that were excluded from the canon. On any, whether it was Chinese medicine, not taken seriously, whether it was meditation that was considered a fancy word for sleep. So many of these wisdom traditions that have been marginalized. I mean, can you imagine logical positivism was considered the apex of philosophical sophistication when I was at university, and we were expected to imbibe that material. Really terribly meaningless analytical linguistic philosophy. Philosophy is supposed to be about the love of wisdom, right? Philosophia, and this is philosophy, or was, that had completely lost any connection to wisdom. So I think we're bringing in those lost traditions as they relate to health, wellness, etc., from China, from India, from Japan, from Tibet, and increasingly north-south, the southern hemisphere as well as the east-west connection. And we're operating out of a more integrated sense of the relationship between body and mind, and so we're not buying into hardcore scientific materialism. We're looking at the interplay between consciousness and the body. So, that's just, one could talk about it for another 15 minutes, but I'll just leave it at that.
Well, I think there should be a Ralph White channel on television. We got 10 million stations, folks, and nothing is on. You can just channel surf. It's all zombies, and then I think, Ralph, we need to get you out there to a bigger audience, Claudia, dear, I want to just take a moment to just pan around this wonderful bohemian apartment and see there is Nanette, your partner looking on very lovingly on this interview. She's going to join us in a few minutes as well. We have our meetings here for the Network of Spiritual Progressives too. And look around, baby. I love to look at the trees out the window there. We are in Long Island City, which has become a very cool, very hip, innovative also neighborhood that's also has a grittiness to it. And Ralph kind of combines all these qualities, in his personality. But I want to just get into your experience in South America, because we're being filmed by my darling wife Claudia, who hails from Bogota, Colombia. And you've had some experiences there that have changed your life. Maybe you could explain a little bit.
About Colombia? Well, when I was 23, I hitchhiked from Canada, Vancouver, to Machu Picchu, and it was a quest in search of the miraculous, you might say. But then ran out of money in South America and wound up living in Bogota for a year. And if you're 25, I was 24 by the time I got there. If you want to live life to the full when you're 24, and life is short, Bogota's a good place to do it. Well, what can I say? The Andes for me are a deeply mystical experience. I have friends, I have lifelong friends to this day. We met at the time of the Cahutic Comet, the total eclipse of the sun. The mountains above Bogota were among the best places in the world to see this perfect eclipse of the sun. It was the day before Christmas, 1973, and I'm bonded for life. Some of them are no longer with us, with the five of us who were on that mountaintop for that day. So I think the mystical beauty of the Andes was deep. It was also to see social injustice up close, because when I got back from that time, I had a renewed respect for the rule of law and human rights. I've always supported these things, but you feel it in your bones when you come back from an exploitative world where there's a tremendous amount of poverty, because Bogota in 1973-74 was almost Dickensian. There were schools of pickpockets, literally, abandoned children sleeping out in doorways. So how do you reconcile the beauty of being in Montserrat, up there on the first light of dawn, where the beautiful ray of the first sun ray of the year falls on the sacred volcano Tolima on the horizon, and all the universe seems in perfect harmony and beauty, and yet as the sun rises further, it burns off all the clouds down below. And then this febrile, seething, impoverished, deeply unjust city of tremendous poverty and brilliance emerges below you. So, and that for me was the story about how do I reconcile those two, the sense of a larger, deeper spiritual reality, a logos, with the existence of deep, profound injustice in the world, and how do we bring those together? And my personal path has involved bringing this spiritual and holistic worldview into the city in New York. And of course, 30-odd years ago, that was considered a kind of mission impossible. Get out of here, it'll never work. This is New York, this is the real world, maybe California, maybe Hawaii. Okay, I'll give you Colorado, but get out of here. This is New York, it's the real world. Yeah. So, but we did it anyway.
Yeah. Oh, my goodness. Well, you're making me think of a lot of things. One, about love. We talk a lot about love on our show, and if it wasn't for the love of my wife, Claudia, we wouldn't have a show, because I shared this idea with her in 2010, and she said yes, and she was very supportive. She also, my wife, Claudia, took me to South America for the first time, so I was able to escape the United States for the first time because of my darling wife. And I still remember waking up in the morning in this little town of Chia, which means moon, the moon in the indigenous language. This beautiful town in a valley that had farmland, and you could see the Andes in the distance, and it was like, it was a whole new dimension of life that I was opened up to, thanks to my darling Claudia. And also, we like to quote Paulo Freire, who says we need to teach for a world in which it's easier to love. So these concepts are all coming together. Ralph, this is like, we would love to have you come back in the future, be part of roundtables. We see this as a beginning in our coverage of the holistic movement, to be like their media. And but this is kind of like Ralph White for Dummies, real quick. We want to get as much covered. The four major holistic centers that I could think of, and I think you had something to do with all four. Maybe we could sort of really quickly just cover this. Findhorn in Scotland was one, okay? In the United States, it was Esalen in California, in Big Sur, the Omega Institute, which is in upstate New York, and your place that you founded, the Open Center. Can you talk briefly about, are those the major centers, or are there other ones, but those are the big ones, right?
Well, I've been deeply involved with 3 of those. A good friend of Esalen. I've spent time at Esalen, but I've never been involved with the inner workings of it. But yes, I did spend 3.5 years at Findhorn in north of Scotland, an intentional spiritual community that is now an eco village and a holistic education centre. And in fact, I have many lifelong friends from there. So I went there in the 70s because they saw themselves as a center of demonstration. It was possible to live in a harmonious relationship with nature and with each other, more or less. So Findhorn was green long before it was cool to be green, because it had a profound engagement with the spiritual intelligence within nature. And now they say, CNBC did a show a year or 2 ago on them, and you can make the claim that Findhorn has the lowest carbon footprint of anywhere on the face of the earth right now. So that's this eco village now, eco village and centre and community up in the far north of Scotland, not where you'd expect a centre to be, certainly not Big Sur in California where Esalen is. So I was there in the 70s, in my 20s. Then really I wound up at Omega Institute for Holistic Studies, which is in Rhinebeck. I connected with Omega in 81, I think it was, and really helped launch Omega at its own home in Rhinebeck, this sort of ramshackle, abandoned old summer camp, Camp Boybrick it was called. It was a Yiddish-speaking camp in the earlier part of the 20th century, but it had been empty for 10 years. So I ran the programs there for the first 2 summers, summer of 82 and 83 at Omega. So that was a crucial moment at Omega, where a make or break time. Unfortunately, it was a make time, and Omega has gone on to flourish since then. I was just there for the annual gathering of holistic centers last week. And then, of course, the Open Center in New York, which we started at the date, I'll never forget the launch date. It was a freezing cold Friday night. It was Friday, January Friday the 13th, 1984, wow. In the place where they said it could never be done, New York City. So the Open Center has now been going since then, and it's 300,000 to 400,000 people have come through. And it's, for 25, 30 years of my life, it was my main creative endeavor. I was really there every day and pouring my life force into it in many different ways. But also beyond that, rather than a 4th center, what I've been involved with for all these years, since 85, 86, is the international network of holistic centers. That's why I was just at Omega last week, and we have centers now from all over North America, from Europe. People are coming from China now. There's a new center emerging right in the middle of Beijing. From Sri Lanka, the wonderful Salvadaya movement from Sri Lanka, that really put the rest of us in the West to shame in terms of, my God, these people are working with high court judges, prisoners on death row, 15,000 villages in the middle of a civil war in Sri Lanka. It was founded by a guy who was a student of Vinoba Bhave, who in turn was a student of Gandhi. So it's that whole wonderful stream coming through in Sri Lanka. I mean, whoa, we have so much to learn from them. But anyway, there is now a global network of holistic centers. I mean, I could go on and on. Yes. Hollyhock up in British Columbia, okay. Brighton Bush Hot Springs in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon, Mount Madonna in the Santa Cruz Mountains. So many. The centers on the East Coast, Kalani, Hanua, in Hawaii, on the Big Island of Hawaii, where I just was for 3 weeks, exactly where the volcano is exploding right now. But of course, they own a Pelé, so let's hope that Pelé doesn't disturb the center. It's a wonderful place. So so it's a global network now.
Well, folks, this is what I call real breaking news, okay? And in a better world, you would hear more about this. Yeah. You can channel surf from now until the cows come home, and not see this kind of content on MSNBC, on CNN. You don't get it, folks. That's why I think we need a new media. I really didn't realize that was a holistic educator until I got to know this kind of work, because my master's degree from NYU was in English education in the mid-90s, and the program was actually very holistic, and it was talking about democracy in education, creating circles in the classrooms, okay? And then I met Rick Ulfik, who's a mutual friend of you and Nanette, and he got me involved in the Foundation for Ethics and Meaning. And I remember the first time we met Ralph, it was after a diner meeting at the Moonstruck Diner on West 23rd, and Rick and I were walking on the sidewalk, and then we bumped into Ralph, and he said, "Oh, John, you got to meet Ralph White. He's an amazing guy. He's doing all this incredible work." And then, so there is a need for this holistic education.
Crucial, you know, because at times of deep crisis, you could say, where our world is going in the wrong direction with global warming, there are these ugly forces of nationalism, fundamentalism, etc. There have to be regenerative impulses in the society, and where are they going to come from in a moment of deep crisis like this? They're not going to come from the establishment. They're probably not going to come from within the universities or within the churches and synagogues, etc. They're going to come from something outside, from people who've stepped away from the mainstream culture, taken their journey, arrived at some deeper truths along the lines that we were first talking about, a more multicultural, independent, free spirituality, a spirituality, an awareness of our interdependence with all life on earth. And that's what we need today. And these impulses are really coming from these independent centers that will meet from all over. We may never have met before. We're totally autonomous initiatives, and yet we can tell almost immediately we're on the same wavelength. We're doing the same larger work. We're all facets of that diamond of consciousness that is shining more brightly as an alternative to the ignorance and materialism and nationalism and fundamentalism that is taking the world, could take the world in the wrong direction if we don't do our bit to speak up for a wiser, more intelligent, well, sustainable view of the world that actually holds the keys for a healthy future for humanity.
And would this also connect in any way with democracy itself? Do you think democracy is under threat now?
I do. You can see these regressive nationalist impulses. You can see the you know, whether it's America first or, you know, whether it's Putin's gangster state in Russia or whatever it is, you can see people all over accruing more and more power to themselves. They're trying to go regress to the era of the strong man, and are usually demonizing some other crowd, whether it's Mexicans or, you know, whether it's Syrian refugees or whoever it is. So yes, there are these counter forces at work in the world, but you know, I'm a fan of Rudolf Steiner, who people know today mostly through Waldorf educational biodynamic agriculture, which is worldwide now. But he said, way back in the aftermath of the First World War in 1919, that we would face 4 primary areas of challenge in the future, in the centuries ahead, and it would be a spiritual test. We'll have to overcome them. But it will happen. The first one is nationalism, because he's in German-speaking Central Europe, so you could tell what and this is 1919, though, before even the rise of the Nazis or the proto-Nazis. So nationalism, grotesque forms of tribalism, religious fundamentalism, what he called the primacy of economic values in all spheres. Think of corporate globalization. The whole world run on the basis of short-term profit to enrich 1% of the world population, and 50 or 60 billionaires owning half the wealth of the rest of humanity, you know, just a grotesquely disproportionate imbalance there. And then the last thing he said that we have to really try to move beyond is what he called the superstition of scientific materialism, because they think that we're the superstitious ones, but actually, as we didn't even know about electricity a couple of hundred years ago, and we're in this vast universe, we think that scientific materialism is the answer to everything, just like when I was a college student, logical positivism was said to be the ultimate answer to philosophy. I mean, please. So we need a little humility in the face of this vast cosmos, but we do know there are great wisdom traditions like the Taoist tradition and the yogic tradition, and because I've been particularly interested in the Western esoteric tradition, the alchemy and so on. You know, the alchemists thought of themselves as the philosophers of nature. Nature was a book. We had to read from it. We should learn from it instead of imposing the dead thoughts of materialism on it and creating a deadening world.
Oh my goodness.
So that's what I think we have to do.
This is so nourishing and enriching, and I feel even transformed while we're having this conversation. And now we're going to make space for Nanette, your partner. But before we do that, okay, Claudia, if you could just pan around and look outside. I love the streetscape of Long Island City, the grittiness, and also the hipness and the artistic nature of the. See, a lot of Bohemia now is actually what I love about coming to your place is the cafe, Sweet Leaf Cafe. We stopped in there this morning, and the whole ambiance, the cultural ambiance. It's even different than Hoboken. As much as we like Hoboken, there's a kind of a bourgeois, materialistic, little bit too white bread type of thing. You have to get out of there. You have to come to places in Brooklyn or Long Island City where Bohemia is migrating to get the really interesting people, the people that are the thought leaders and the innovators. So as we make room for Nanette, I'm going to play this, and now I'm playing the Shaman's Rattle, which to welcome Nanette. This was a gift to Ralph. To Ralph, okay, and both of you are a gift to our world. And we're so grateful to have you. I've been meaning to have Nanette on for a long time because she has had a huge impact on my life, spiritually and politically, and culturally and socially in this organization, the Network of Spiritual Progressives that you are the coordinator of in the New York City area. So welcome to the show, Nanette. And
great pleasure to be. It's a great pleasure to be here and to share the stage here with yourself and with Ralph. And what a wonderful interviewer you are, John. I enjoyed your style.
oh my
Yeah, and a great synergy between you and Ralph. I really enjoyed the interviews so far. And of course, it's been a great pleasure to be with John over all these years as our fellow comrades in the network of spiritual progressives, and share many insights and our own activism as a group. And it's been very meaningful to me, our friendship and our community together. So I'm glad to be here.
Thank you. I've actually written letters to the editor of the Hoboken Reporter, which is where we live, to try to get a chapter of the Network of Spiritual Progressives started there. So far, it hasn't really taken root there, but we're still hopeful to try to get these ideas out to a broader audience. And and we're so glad that Claudia is here filming us, because this is Claudia's first visit to your apartment. Your cool, hip, and spiritually grounded apartment in Long Island City. So Nanette, maybe you could talk a little bit about your own feelings about Ralph's work and how you work together as this dynamic couple that are both so world-changing. How does it work to be like married to Ralph? Oh, not married, you're partners. I'm sorry, you're partners. Domestic partners, folks. That's the new word. Okay. So talk a little bit about your work together and how you met, maybe, or.
Sure. Well, thank you, John. That's a great question. Ralph and I actually met working on a conference that you were at, which is the Reimagining Politics and Society at the Millennium. And so we met around preparing that conference together, and that was a very meaningful way to meet, because we were both doing work that we really believed in, that was grounded in both our spirituality and our activism. And I think that's a core aspect of our partnership, is the meeting place of those two places, of those two pieces of ourselves, and being able to share those and learn from each other. And of course, we're each in very different realms of work. I'm a lawyer. I work in a organization called Bronx Legal Services. John has a mug from LSNY, Legal Services for New York City, where I've had most of my legal career. And we do social justice lawyering. We represent low-income people in many different cases. We work with the community. We try to impact the conditions that create poverty. So that's been my main work for many years, and Ralph's been a great support in just helping me think through a lot of what I'm doing in that work, and just with other perspectives on it. And then I've also been involved, as you spoke, with the Network of Spiritual Progressives, which I connected to when it was in an earlier form through Tikkun magazine back in the early 90s, 1991 actually. So I've been connected to that movement since 1991, when it was first here in New York City with Michael Lerner and later Peter Gable, who I met, and around the effort. I'm working with an organization that I helped create called the Project for Integrating Spirituality, Law, and Politics, called PISLAP. And talking about Ralph, Ralph has been actually an honorary PISLAP member for years, and wrote and came to one of our national retreats out in California and wrote a fabulous piece called From Hired Guns to Healers, the movement to renew legal culture. And that piece was very seminal to our movement and to our efforts together. And people read that piece because it was very, you talked about that gritty, practical, but spiritual, but humorous take that Ralph has. And Ralph brought that to his piece on PISLAP. And Ralph's attended almost every PISLAP conference and has really made a contribution, knows the people involved. They consider him part of the movement, someone who brings insight to it. So being able to share our work with each other, even though we're in different realms of activity. Of course, I've shared with Ralph, since I've known him, almost all the esoteric quests that he's created. The esoteric quests have been journeys of discovery to look at the lost spiritual history of the West in many, many different places in Europe, in one in America, and this summer we're actually going to the Andes. We're going to be in Peru and in Bolivia, exploring the lost world of the Incas. And so being able to journey on those quests and the insights that I received on those quests have been very important to me in my own work and my own development. So those are a few thoughts.
Thank you so much, Nanette. I'm so glad to have you on the show finally. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about also Claudia and I, that we together co-produced this TV show. So there's no hierarchy, there's no memos, corporate going back and forth. We'll sit over breakfast and we'll decide who would be a good guest, Ralph and Nanette, of course, So Ralph, you actually dedicated this book to Nanette and to others, but certainly Nanette is the first dedication in this book. Talk a little bit about your thoughts about Nanette. In terms of your work and your partnership. This is the day of the royal wedding. I want people to know. We watched this morning. Harry has got us into love, right? So a little bit about love.
About love. Well, what can we say? No, Nanette has been the most loving, supportive partner for me in my work that I could ever possibly want. I'm somebody, as I was saying earlier, who's not just somebody with a spiritual, esoteric, mystical worldview, but I'm somebody with a strong engagement with social justice and political justice as well. So it's important to me to be with a partner who really embodies that. I really admire the way Nanette has devoted more than a quarter of a century of her life to social justice for the poor, legal justice for the poor in the South Bronx, when the South Bronx was one of the roughest, toughest hoods in New York and in the world, in America, for a long time. So that's very, very important to me, that my partner's work life emerges from values of social justice that I can really relate to in working with the poor. That's I don't get to do that so much through the holistic world because it's mostly a world of educated people. I'd like to be able to do more, but the economics of it all puts certain limitations. So it's important to me that we have that balance. I'm working more in cultural change, cultural evolution, as it were, and Nanette's working more in the realm of social and legal justice, but I think they complement each other well.
Well, you made me think of the Tom Wolfe novel, Bonfire of the Vanities, because Tom Wolfe just died this week. He was 89 years old, and it was his first novel. He was 56 years old, and he captured the wealth inequality in New York City in that book. And I think the opening scene, there was a guy, a very wealthy stock trader, who gets off the off-ramp in the Bronx, and he kills somebody accidentally. So it really captures that whole. So you're right in the middle of that, Nanette, in terms of.
In that area, I work right near where that happened. Of course, that area has changed quite a bit since then. But yes, I know that area well.
You know, it just feels like such a delight to be here, to be in this circle. And I want this circle to expand. And that's why we're putting it on television, because we want to create a curriculum on television so people can be invited into this and create these kind of circles in their own communities and to expand the wellness, spiritual, holistic movement throughout the world. We were together last week, Nanette, out in Long Island in the home of Bruce, who is our comrade in the Network of Spiritual Progressives. We had a circle in that living room, and we shared our thoughts and feelings about how to move forward, and in particular with politics. Let's get into a little real politique here, and how can we create a movement of change? Well, one day will political candidates be talking about this stuff that we're talking about here?
I certainly hope so, and I think it's starting. I think it's starting to happen. You know, in our NSP work and community, we talk about a new bottom line that society and institutions, including government, that the new bottom line upon which they're based, their foundational bottom line, is one of justice. It's one of care for the other. It's about community, equity. It's also about awe and wonder, appreciating the beauty of nature, the magic of nature, the magic of other human beings, and of what we create together. So I think, you know, the grounding and the holistic movement is bringing that consciousness to our society in ways that can then prepare the society to integrate them into government. So I think we're poised through the work of the holistic movement in part to create that new bottom line. And I still feel hopeful despite what's going on right now.
Me too. And we had another school shooting yesterday. 10 people were killed in California. No, it was California, I think. Was it California or it was Texas? It was Texas. And what's interesting, when you watch the mainstream media, they never talk about the unhappiness that's underneath a lot of this stuff in the terms of how can we create healing and more peaceful people and energy in the society. That's something that's completely left out of the equation. It's always like, obviously you have to deal with the gun issue, but you go deeper in your work, and I'm just waiting for this shift to happen in the larger culture, that we can really start talking in a broader way in our politics and our educational system about the healing that needs to happen, about the need for a shorter work week so people aren't so exhausted, and about an educational system that doesn't just stress the corporate values of get a job, go out and make money, but how can we become better human beings, more loving, more kind, more compassionate? And like you said, if you tune into nature, if you tune into the beauty that's around us, you can be happier in your own actual life instead of taking a Prozac. Get high on the beauty of flowers and trees. And does that make any sense? Or?
Yes, I mean, how do these deep cultural changes happen? I mean, obviously, we have a pathological situation here. I mean, I just can't stand one more school shooting, the disgrace of the National Rifle Association. I mean, I believe there's information coming out now that Russian money was channeled into the Trump campaign via the NRA. I just was reading that, I hope it comes out more. Yes. We have Oliver North now, head of the NRA. I think this is a great opportunity to go after those people. They're a disgraceful, death-like force in American culture. So there's that level, the pure political level. I hope they will be exposed as an organization that is an offense to American democracy. and justice. But on a deeper level, there is, the whole cultural transformation. What is this sickness in our culture that is producing all these disturbed young people? Yes, they shouldn't have access to all these weapons. It's ridiculous to give them military-grade automatic rifles and this kind of thing. But deeper than that, what is it in our culture that's giving people a sense of meaninglessness? Why are people being attracted to join ISIS and Al-Qaeda? Because instead of just hanging out in a street corner, smoking a joint or doing some petty crime in Europe, let's say, the people who become members of those organizations, if they become a member of ISIS, they become like a Jedi Knight. Suddenly their lives are infused with meaning. And if you look at this, just the vacuity of American life, the empty shopping malls, the relentless TV, the superficiality of the celebrity culture, the constant focus upon money and people who make huge amounts of money being offered. I think one of the terrible indictments of our time in the future will be the superficiality of our culture. And we need to get, to a whole profound change. I mean, I've been a long-time supporter of the Waldorf schools, and I think they are growing more and more. They're spreading like wildfire in China, of all places, right now. But when you think that when Steiner died, there were only 2 in 1925, and now there's over 1,000, and they're growing everywhere. So, but what I like about that is, for children, it's for the education of the head, the heart, and the hands. They don't learn. They don't read. They don't watch television. They don't read until they're 7. It's about the cultivation of the autonomy and the creativity of the child, and that, whether it's Waldorf specifically or whatever, Montessori, whatever approach it is, there needs to be more emphasis upon drawing out the potential of the child within, rather than trying to just train them to fit into the global economic machine as peons in this life-destroying global economy that is wrecking the biosphere and obscenely enriching a tiny proportion of the world. So I think we've got to work on multiple levels.
And I want to also say something about education, because that's my field, that I've been able to bring these ideas to students only because I've had one foot in these worlds. By going to meetings with Nanette and Ralph and people like Rick Ulfick. Then the next day I'd be teaching a class, let's say, at Essex County College in Newark, and I'd be able to bring up some of these concepts, like, is it possible to live in a world based on love and generosity rather than greed, and then get a dialogue going with the students, which I would not have been able to do that had I not been exposed to these environments and these groups and this movement. And I think about the other teachers that are not involved in this, and they're overworked. They're spending an entire day, and then they have to come home and grade papers. And in the curriculums of these schools, there's nothing about holistic in terms of 90%. So, I want to just bring that up and name that as a problem, and also say how happy I am for the work you're both doing, and how we want to be more in touch with you, even with our show, to sort of check in with Ralph and Nanette and what's going on. Are there any new upcoming meetings? And so what's new? Looking forward, this is May of 2018. Is what's on your mind and thoughts in terms of upcoming stuff?
Well, in terms of the endeavors I'm involved in, we have the Project for Integrating Spirituality, Law, and Politics has a very exciting conference coming up that we're planning in Washington, D.C. in October 11th through 14th. If you're interested in checking it out, we're at spiritlawpolitics.org. We're looking at issues like the impact of restorative justice and restorative practices on opening up space in the legal culture for healing approaches to crime, to social violence, to community violence, to violence in the schools, to bringing people together in community to really talk about their feelings around these issues, to apologize, to repair harm. So we're looking at new transformative ways of approaching legal education. So John talked about his work in public education, in college, and in bringing holistic principles, and we're trying to bring those same holistic principles to legal education, to training of lawyers, because of course the way we're trained is really very, very much impacts the way we practice. And similarly, there's a movement in law schools right now to bring contemplative practice, so meditation and mindfulness practices to one's approach, to one's way of being a lawyer, to be more mindful, more aware, more conscious of our relationships, of the way that we work and how it affects society and affects the larger culture. So I'm very excited to be a part of that and to help plan that. So that's something great that's coming up for me.
Yeah, I want to say I think you're definitely one of the most transformative couples in our country, on our planet, and I didn't realize that even our show, we could call our show a holistic television show, because we are supporting these kind of values. I wanted to give a shout out to Bill Clinton, because he did write a letter back to me when I wrote to him telling him about the activities of Judson Memorial Church, which has been a very inspirational place to me. Judson Church brings together spirituality and politics and culture and arts, and he wrote me a nice letter. And he was also involved in the NSP, the Network of Spiritual Progressives. And Ralph, you just told me this morning over coffee that he also was supportive of your activities.
Responded to when the Open Center organized the first conference on social responsible investing way back in the 80s. He was the only active politician who responded to our, well, he didn't say he could come, but he wrote a very nice support. He understood what it was all about. He's obviously very attuned to progressive political impulses.
Now, since I don't have a watch, I'm not like a watch person. Claudia, could you tell us how much time is left here? We have 10 minutes. Oh, that's lovely. So, Ralph, talk a little bit about what's next and what's upcoming.
Right, well, I am going to be... Well, the Open Center will be presenting the 14th of its Esoteric Quest conferences. We've been doing these since 1995. Do you want to hand me the brochure there? This is the first time we will have done Latin America. All the others have been in Europe, except for one. This is an esoteric quest for the lost world of the Incas and the living spirituality of indigenous Peru and Bolivia. So we want, the Incan culture was an extraordinarily sophisticated thing before it was destroyed by the Spaniards at the beginning of the 16th century. But today there's a remarkable resurgence, Pachamama, feeling for the values of the earth. The Aymara and Quechua peoples in South America. Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, the first indigenous president in 500 years. They're trying to really come from that deep indigenous place. We're going back to the Incan and pre-Incan spiritualities, a deep respect for the earth, that we have to live in harmony with it. Whether this is coming from so many directions now. But anyway, when we go, we're going to be going down to Peru and Bolivia, Machu Picchu, the Sacred Valley, Cuzco, Lake Titicaca, Tiahuanaco. We're going to have some exquisite, serene nights and days on the lake in the islands of the sun and the moon, the birthplace of Incan mythology. So, the reason I've done these is because in our holistic world, there's such a strong emphasis upon the Eastern paths, yoga, Buddhism, Zen, Tibetan, also shamanism to us. But the Western esoteric tradition, which for those of us of a European descent, it's our indigenous tradition. Why shouldn't we be paying attention to our indigenous tradition as well as that of all over? I mean, we're living in a time of multicultural spirituality, in my view. So I've done now this series beginning in an alchemical castle in Bohemia. As that chapter in my book, I've always said I'm a natural bohemian. Bohemia really exists. Yeah, Český Krumlov, the southern Bohemian mecca of alchemists. That's where this conference series began almost quarter of a century ago, in this beautiful little place that, because it was behind the Iron Curtain in Czechoslovakia, was not exploited or developed, that I stumbled across. Little did I know that we would have this series. So we're going to be doing this on the world. I think the following year we're going going to return to our theme of the mysteries of the North. We were in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. We were in the most remote parts of Iceland, looking at Norse mythology. And I think in 2019 we're going to go to Lapland to continue phase 3 of the mysteries of the North. Because with all, I love all the East-West stuff, but this is innovative, and this is the first time we're going to link the Western esoteric tradition with the pre-Columbian and current indigenous spirituality. A conversation that should have happened 500 years ago, but better late than never.
Ralph, you make me want to go for my dreams even more in terms of going out there and going on quests and having adventures. And even as a teacher, when I talk to my students and talk about what is your dream, I get a silence now, which is kind of disturbing. When I try to encourage my students to go for their biggest dreams, and most of them have been so reduced to being just practical, getting a job, being part of the system. It's not their fault. It's the system we live in, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm totally with Bernie Sanders. I mean, there should be it's outrageous that kids are graduating with these $30,000, $40,000, $60,000 worth of debt that it takes, it costs you, $120,000 just to get a bachelor's at NYU. I mean, this is ridiculous. I was fortunate to graduate with no college debt, because if you get to university in my day in Britain, the government paid for it, but there were very few people who actually could get there. But yeah, I mean, we have to reform the whole educational system, and I like the idea of making community colleges free for people, forgiving student debt. We just need to tax the rich more instead of, them accumulating obscene amounts of money. Let's spread the wealth, let's educate the people, and let's unlock the keys to creativity in our culture.
So speaking of dreams and turning to Nanette, what would you say, Nanette, your dream is going forward? What quest, what dream motivates you in the morning to get up and go out and go forward?
Well, John, I'm a person who's about connection. I love people. I'm deeply connected to my quest and my dream to feel close to others and to feel like I'm making a contribution to their lives, and in turn being able to experience their contribution to mine. So I love creating communities. I love nurturing communities. And so a lot of the work that I do in the world, whether it's building a bond with my clients and really feeling with them what they're experiencing, helping them fight for justice, supporting them, whether it's the things that we've talked about, the NSP or the PISLAP movement, or being part of the holistic endeavors that Ralph is connected to. These are all for me about creating deeper, loving connections and community with others. So those are the dreams that give me strength in the morning.
Well, as we start to wind up, I'm going to bring a kind of a strange and unusual question into the mixture of the dialogue. I'm going to turn to music, because Ralph has said in his book that something about the rock and roll that was beginning to percolate back in the 60s that really spoke to you, and it broke through the grimness and the grayness of industrial England. What has been the role of music in your life?
Oh, music, rock and roll, pop music, blues, all that kind of stuff. It's been the soundtrack of my life, and of course a whole generation. I mean, it's probably the predominant art form that has nourished my psyche over the years. So ever since I was, growing up in the grim, grimy, soot-covered being a teenager in the north of England, just 80 miles down the road from Liverpool, it was the music that really, when people ask me what got me through teenage years, it was rock and roll and lukewarm beer. It was the only drug we had. It was better than nothing, but the music made up for a lot. So yeah, I mean, to this day, I love Pandora and Spotify. I mean, I love there's there's so much music that has been so supportive of me. The way the rock musicians in the late 60s, early 70s, they were having spiritual insights because they were doing a lot of psychedelics, but they were writing about profound mystical things when mainstream culture, like the universities or mainstream poets and so on, were ignoring all of this. The musicians, the Beatles and so on, they were way ahead of their time in understanding love. You look at George Harrison, he did the first world music concert in Madison Square Garden for Bangladesh, the first social justice or international justice conference, so they introduced us to Indian music. I mean, I think the musicians of the 60s and 70s did a huge amount to open the world to meditation and spirituality. They were streets ahead of any other art form. And to this day, I have a drink at my wonderful little local pub. Jackson's over there. And, the music still speaks to me. I mean, I come back to New York from here, and the musical environment that we live in here in New York, we're so rich musically here that I feel it's a blessing of being in New York, is the musical ambience that we swim in here.
Wow. And I remember Cornel West once said that when he moved back to Harlem, came back to New York from Princeton, he was living in New York for a while, he said it was the music of Harlem. He was missing that soul, that music. I still recall the night before my first teaching job, which was in 1994 in Hoboken, hearing a Motown song by the Supremes, "Someday We'll Be Together." And the lush harmony and the beauty of that song somehow is associated with the birth of my teaching profession. And I also have been looking more into the research into the musicality of dialogue. And even what we're doing now is a kind of a jazz-like riff. Yes, exactly. It's very. So you want to say something about music, Nanette, or art in some way?
Oh, sure. Oh, music. Yeah, I mean, I have a little bit of a different soundtrack in my earlier years, which is I come from a deep in engagement and connection to the Jewish tradition, and really grew up with beautiful liturgical music that was very deeply seeped very deep into my soul, and that music was very important to me as I grew up because it connected to me, to my heart, to my spirituality, and of course I love all of the music of our era, and I was an activist really from earliest childhood, and so the music of social justice, the folk music, and rock and roll were very important to me.
Now this turns to a spontaneous moment that happened today when Claudia and I were on our way here. We took the bus from Hoboken to Port Authority, and then we're walking toward the 7 train, and they had some subway musicians. There was a band, they were South American, and you could hear the Andean pipes, and they were playing How Great Thou Art. I said, what a perfect song to be coming here to do this show that we've been meaning to do a long time about spirituality and the transformation of culture, the creation of a better world that might be, with Ralph White and Nanette Schorr in their lovely Long Island City apartment. Claudia, we're out of time. Oh my God, it seems like we're just starting. So this is a new beginning with you on our show, and we love you, we care about your work, and we hope that you'll come back and continue the conversation.
Well, thank you, John. It's been a total pleasure. Anytime.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nanette.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Claudia, and Ralph. It's been a delight. I've enjoyed it. I was nervous, but I'm glad I did it.
Wonderful. You're wonderful. Thank you so much. Till next time on the Public Voice Salon.